By exercising fiscal restraint, we're ensuring that we can continue to invest in Canadians and in the Canadian economy for years to come, just as we have done since 2015.
And today, she rolls out a bonanza of $43 billion of new inflation, debt, and taxes that will be on the backs of everyday, hard-working Canadians. We set three
things in the budget worth commending. They're very familiar items to those of us in the NDP caucus here who have called for affordability measures like another doubling of the GST rebate, for a Canada-wide dental insurance plan that's now on the way, for real and meaningful labor conditions around federal investments in clean tech to ensure that it's not just companies but workers that actually benefit from the investments that we have to make to launch ourselves into the new energy economy, and meaningful investment for Indigenous people living in urban, rural, and northern communities that are struggling, as many Canadians are.
Well, let's get the Government of Canada's perspective on today's federal budget from the Minister of Tourism and the Associate Minister of Finance, Randy Boissonnault, who joins me now. Minister, thanks for making the time.
It's my pleasure, Wyatt.
Let's start out with kind of one of the big centerpieces of today's budget, this grocery rebate for Canadians, providing $467 for families of up to 4 people. And there's some other eligibility criteria in there as well. I'm sure a lot of Canadians will appreciate that investment. But when looking in that investment, what else is the federal government doing on the affordability front, considering that, yes, obviously, I'm sure that investment, again, is appreciated, but in many cases, $467 may only compensate for a family of 4 for, say, maybe 3, maybe 4 trips to the grocery store.
Well, I appreciate that analysis. And so you've summarized the Canada grocery rebate well. And I think if we step back, Wyatt, and just think about what we're trying to do here, we had 2 really big, important goalposts with this budget, right? Preserve the AAA credit rating as the Government of Canada, but at the same time, invest in those people who need it the most and not stoke the fires of inflation. And so you've seen our government make, great investments in supply side economics. So everything from the childcare funding to the funding that we have with the Canada Child Benefit. In budget 23, we have other affordability measures such as making sure that we have a 40% increase in Canada student loans, and also allowing students to access more money out of their RESP. It hasn't been raised in 25 years, and so we've gone up from $5,000 to $8,000, so that's going to make things more affordable for students. We also are making sure that we attack some of these issues of affordability, like predatory loan rates. We're going to bring those down. We're also going to make sure that we go after junk fees. And, it seems like a small issue, but, if you have a phone or you have different people in your family and different phones, you got, 5 or 6 or 7 different chargers. We're going to harmonize those chargers for devices as well. And I think those affordability measures, when you add to the fact that we've got now in this budget, $4 billion set aside for urban, Indigenous, rural, remote, and northern housing, that's an important close the gap measure. That's really important. And the other affordability measure, and maybe it helps us segue into the second big pillar of the budget, Wyatt, is dental care. We've got, hundreds of thousands of Canadians, who make less than $90,000 a year, and they haven't had access to dental supports. It's too expensive. It's out of reach. And so we are committing for the long term, and it's a $13 billion piece of the budget, to have a permanent dental care program in place. We're going to start with 0 to 12, like we've already put in place, go from 12 to 18, and then expand from there. We just think it's the right thing to do to make sure that, Canadians who make a lower income are able to access dental supports.
And again, talk to me a little bit more about dental care in the sense of, obviously, this is something in particular that has been a big focal point of the supply and confidence deal with the NDP that your government has. When you look at dental care, how important was it for your government to make an investment of that nature in a program that I'm sure will help a large range of Canadians?
Well, I think, look, if we wanted to slow walk this, Wyatt, we would have, started at 0 to 12 and maybe held there. But the Liberal government, our government, believes in this program, believes in what we're trying to do to make dental care affordable for a broad swath of Canadians. And look, we should be in a country as wealthy as Canada is that, some of our most vulnerable citizens, our neighbors, are able to make sure that their kids can have their teeth cleaned, and that they themselves can make sure that they get a filling fixed, and that they're able to actually have good oral health. And I think, it was a missing piece of healthcare. And the fact that we've been able to deliver this directly through CRA is an elegant solution to something that's, perplexed different governments. And so as a Liberal government, we're proud to do this, and we're gonna keep leaning in on making sure that Canadians have these kind of affordability supports while preserving our AAA credit rating, and make sure that we don't stoke the fires of inflation, because we want to make sure. And look, the Bank of Canada governor said this in his last report, is that we're actually looking at 3% inflation, down to 3% inflation by the summer, and closer to 2% by December, which is very normal for inflation rates. And then we would anticipate interest rates, to lower, to follow that lower level inflation.
And I mean, when you look at the projected deficits as well, obviously that's been, I'm sure, an important issue for the Ministry of Finance when looking at how to construct this budget. How can you and how will the Ministry of Finance balance something like building a $40.1 billion budget with also at the same point in time balancing it to ensure that Canadians don't necessarily have to pay more in taxes, in other words, keeping inflation low?
So back to the AAA credit rating, right? Like, we are at all-time low levels for being able to finance the debt that we have as Canadians, much lower than we saw pre-pandemic. And that's an important piece of how we're able to invest in the future. And part of the reason we're making these investments with the $40 billion in this year's budget deficit is to build the next economy. Like, we're talking about a million EV batteries built at the St. Thomas plant built here by Volkswagen in my own city of Edmonton. We're going to have the world's largest net zero hydrogen plant, like the LNG plant in Kitimat. When go down the list of even the president talked about Bromont, Quebec, and all the great things that are going to be happening there, and the corridor that we're going to have between Albany and Bromont, Quebec. I mean, when we're talking about making sure that we're building an economy for the future, for your future and the future of millions of Canadians, now's the time to make this generational investment so that we have these building blocks for the economy of the future. If we don't, Wyatt, you could live through the deindustrialization of the country, and we don't want to see that. And so the naysayers will be, saying nay, and those of us who are optimistic and bullish about Canada's future are going to continue to make these generational investments.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Associate Minister of Finance and Minister of Tourism, Randy Boissonnault. Minister, thanks so much. Appreciate it. I know you have a busy schedule today, so thanks again.
Always a pleasure, Wyatt. Take care. Bye now.
Jasraj Singh Hallan joins me now for the perspective of the official opposition Conservatives. He's the opposition finance critic. Thanks so much for making the time.
Hey, thanks for having me, Wyatt.
Yeah, you too. I want to start out with looking at this federal budget. Do the Conservatives ultimately believe, on kind of a general question, with all of the issues impacting Canadians, affordability, Indigenous reconciliation, climate change, so many issues, do the Conservatives believe that the budget was enough to kind of make its mark? And if not, what else could the government have done?
Absolutely not. Look, Wyatt, this Liberal NDP budget is it's an attack on the hardest working people in Canada. People that work, this is a direct attack on their paychecks. We had three simple asks of the government. One was to bring home lower prices, which means getting rid of the carbon tax and other deficit spending. The next task was to bring home more powerful paychecks by reducing taxes on Canadians so they can take more home. And the third thing was to bring home more affordable homes for young people and others so they can actually get into housing. This didn't address any of those. And actually, it's going to make the cost of living crisis worse, because now we know that they've contributed with this budget $40.1 billion in new deficit spending, which is inflationary, which will make taxes go up, and it'll bring in more pain for Canadians.
And when you look at kind of diving into some of the specific aspects, I mean, I spoke, for example, with Roseanne Archibald, the national chief at the Assembly of First Nations, who said that she believed the government didn't invest the amount of funds necessary into Indigenous reconciliation. On the healthcare aspect, not a whole lot into healthcare. There was obviously the dental care aspect of things. So, I mean, looking at the issues with the messages coming from various industry and, the government needing to balance what they're doing between government spending and investments in programs, how do you think the government can do that, could do that, should have done that?
Look, I think that our Conservative plan is very clear on how we can get more powerful paychecks into the country, better jobs, and a better economy. What we need to do is get the government gatekeepers out of the way. We need to make sure that we're lowering taxes and bringing down this inflationary deficit spending that this Liberal NDP government have been doing for the last 8 years. We need to make sure that we're bringing home good Canadian projects that are bringing good Canadian jobs for our people so that we can get our people back on track. That's how we're going to solve this cost of living crisis. When we look at the housing crisis, this is a supply issue. We need to get municipal gatekeepers out of the way and have a tie-in with federal dollars and with municipal dollars so that we can get more homes built and find those municipalities that aren't getting projects completed. We need to make sure that we're getting harmful bills like Bill C-69 and Bill C-48 and this job-killing carbon tax out of the way so Canada becomes more competitive. What we can also do is with these energy projects that we have such good resources here in Canada, we can partner with our First Nations, and our leader Pierre Poilievre has been going coast to coast talking to First Nations communities on how we can work on together to get economic reconciliation, working on that together and getting good projects built here so we can have long-term prosperity for everyone across the board in Canada.
And when you look at the, I guess, response from your party, from Pierre Poilievre, and from the entirety of your Conservative Party caucus, what your caucus would have done versus what the government has done, I guess when you look at future budget cycles versus this budget cycle, what can the Conservatives do to ensure that more of what you're looking for actually can end up in a federal budget?
Well, first of all, it's a forming government, a good Conservative government under the leadership of future Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre. That's how we're going to get this country back on track. As I said before, it's the gatekeepers with the support of this Liberal government that have stopped from good projects being completed here. You know, this government after 8 years has done nothing but failures, like many announcements. And for example, this government is the one that's going to spend $89 billion on housing. And literally with the announcements that they make, they've made housing rent and mortgages double in this country. So everything they do, they're spending a whole lot of money with getting very little output for that. And the results are even worse. And at the end of the day, this is all on the backs of hardworking Canadians. We need to make sure that we're bringing down tax, bringing down the deficit, so we bring home more powerful paychecks for the hardest working and the most vulnerable here in Canada. And we make sure that we bring it home with lower prices for them so that, today it's sad to see that there's 1.5 million people visiting a food bank or 1 in 5 Canadians skipping meals. We literally have seniors turning down the heat in their home and wearing blankets because they're choosing between eating and heating. This is not right. This is not the Canada that me and my family immigrated to. We need to bring that prosperity and bring home that Canadian dream that myself and many other immigrants came here for as well, that many Canadians don't see today.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Conservative finance critic Jasraj Singh Hallan, thanks so much for your time as always. Appreciate it.
Great to see you as always, Wyatt. Thank you.
For some more reaction to today's federal budget, British Columbia Premier David Eby joins me now. Premier, thank you for joining me.
Well, thanks, Wyatt. Thanks for having me. You're my first interview on the federal budget. It's great to be here with you.
Let's start out with, I know you were looking specifically for some housing affordability measures in today's budget. I guess more in general, as it relates to affordability, were you satisfied with what you saw today?
Well, there was a housing component that we've been looking for a while from the federal government, which was around Indigenous housing. It's a significant issue in British Columbia, the need for the federal government to step up and build housing on reserve for Indigenous communities across the province. It's just really vital, and it was good to see that in the budget. And in terms of broad affordability initiatives, certainly glad to see the federal government working on that as well. It's a big focus for us here in British Columbia, the rising costs of just about everything due to global inflation. And so seeing some federal government recognition of that is really important.
And when you look at some specific measures that the government is taking, for example, their grocery rebate that they've introduced with about $467 to families of about 4 people, depending on certain eligibility criteria, do you think that will meet the mark as it relates to addressing some of these affordability concerns and addressing the cost of living?
Yeah, well, I think some of the challenges that we're facing are short term. You know, when we have supply chain issues that have driven up costs, or energy costs or food costs driven up by the war in Ukraine, these are hopefully transitory costs that are going to pass over time. The costs are going to come down. So those kinds of rebates are things that we've done here provincially as well to provide support to families to get them through this time period. But longer term and looking towards the future, what we really want to do is build structures in our province and our country that keep costs lower for people. So when we look at things like the cost of gasoline, for example, going up in British Columbia, electrifying our economy, getting away from fossil fuels and generating that electricity here in BC provides cost stability for people and long-term predictability. When we look at groceries, we say, well, how can we support farmers in BC to produce more food here at home for British Columbians, and addressing that kind of thing. So also nice to see in the federal budget that that electricity focus, because we believe as well that can provide not just jobs in British Columbia, but also carbon pollution reduction and affordability all in one.
And when you look at the issue of healthcare, that's obviously an issue that, healthcare transfers, et cetera, not just an issue with British Columbia, but really with all the provinces and territories between the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments. Were you satisfied with what you heard with respect to that today?
Well, we've got a lot of work to do on healthcare, and a lot of these conversations that showed up in the budget here today are conversations that have been taking place for a while at the provincial and federal level. First of all, can I say how much I'm enjoying your questions? So we've been having a good back and forth with the federal government on that, and they made their announcement about their intention in this budget. It's good to see that realized, about consistent funding going forward. Some of the most important pieces for the federal government around healthcare are not necessarily budgetary. Things like making sure that healthcare workers can work anywhere in the country, making sure that our immigration system is welcoming and encouraging and recognizing the skills of international healthcare workers, really important. Ensuring standards nationally around electronic health records, all stuff that the federal government can do, helping coordinate the purchase of things like drugs and medical equipment, where we can find cost savings nationally. These are all important pieces of work as well, but really good to see in the budget that consistent commitment. Obviously, we've got a lot more work to do, though. This is a huge national issue.
Okay, we'll leave it there. British Columbia Premier David Eby. Premier, thanks so much for making time. I know probably a super busy day for you, so thank you again.
Yeah, very busy day, Wyatt, but lots of fun to make time for you, and congratulations on your journalism.
Roseanne Archibald is the National Chief at the Assembly of First Nations, and she joins me now. Thanks so much for making the time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, good to see you, Wyatt.
You as well. Let's just start out. To what extent are you satisfied? Obviously, when looking at the federal budget today, there's lots of programs. It seems a big focus on things like groceries, things like the cost of living. Do you feel as if, in issues of Indigenous reconciliation were addressed to the extent that they needed to in the federal budget?
There's one area that I really appreciated investment in, and that is missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. There was some funding announcement there for families and advocates regarding the National Action Plan. And I think that that's long overdue. We really need to end this tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S+ peoples. And so I really welcome that part of the budget. For the most part, the remainder of the budget is really, for me, a cyclical kind of process, and they do call it a budget cycle for that reason. But it's really frustrating for First Nations, Wyatt, because it's really a cycle of perpetuating poverty and third world conditions for many of our communities. It's a repetitive injustice is what it is. And it's this pattern of chronic underfunding of First Nations. A good example is we need $63 billion to bring our housing up to the standards that every other Canadian enjoys. A very reasonable request, and we got less than 10% of the ask for that. There are many examples of this government not really making substantive investments to lift First Nations out of poverty and to create equality and to create equity for us. And so this cycle has to, in my view, end, and we do that by establishing a national prosperity table whose main focus would be on developing a new economic deal for First Nations that's outside of this cyclical budgetary process. You know, all of the wealth that's being generated here on Turtle Island, now known as Canada, is on First Nations and lands and waters, whether it's resource extraction or taxation. All of that wealth is being built upon First Nations lands. And so we sign treaties and have international covenants to share in that wealth. And that has not happened for First Nations. Many people, non-Indigenous people, get to enjoy the wealth and safety and protection here in Canada, but First Nations don't. And, I just wanted to quickly talk about the Amnesty International report, which talked about Canada's track record on Indigenous rights being a national disgrace. And to me, this budget is along those lines as well.
And you alluded to the fact that you believe the repeated pattern of underfunding for Indigenous peoples, for Indigenous reconciliation, kind of in general there. What can the government do to, I guess, provide compensation to Indigenous peoples for, I guess, their sufferings, you could say, for, the repeated underfunding, as you alluded to?
Well, the new economic deal is really about sharing in the wealth of this country. So we have to look at things like the GDP, the revenues that are generated here on Turtle Island, and have First Nations have a fair share of that. And these budgetary cycles are not a fair share of that, because otherwise, if we had a fair share of the resources, which are our birthright, by the way, then we would live in prosperity and not poverty. We would have schools that were of the same standard as everyone else. We would have infrastructure that is of the same standard as every other Canadian enjoys. We would have clean drinking water. More than 34, 35 boil water advisories exist right now. And that's a basic human right, to have clean drinking water. And that's something that many First Nations don't enjoy at this time. And so the new economic deal is what we really need to be working toward.
And then I guess just lastly, before we conclude, overall, as a whole, when looking at this budget, do you see it as a way to potentially, be able to work with the government on, perhaps other federal budget? I mean, did it give you an indication that this could potentially be a stepping stone for programs that could potentially help Indigenous peoples? What did you make of it on that front?
Well, today I'm in Queen's Park, Wyatt, and I had a meeting with Premier Doug Ford where we talked about the success of the Ontario Prosperity Table, which is something that I had worked to establish when I was the Ontario Regional Chief. And we need to transfer that up to the national level. There are ways to approach First Nation issues that will create success. And that's what this government has to begin to focus on, is listening to First Nations and the needs that we have. One of the things that I've talked about as well since I've started my term is to establish a national healing fund. Many of our children, our little ones, are being recovered from these former institutions of assimilation and genocide. I don't call them schools anymore. And that always activates a deep grief and intergenerational trauma. And we need those investments in healing processes so that not only can we move forward in a good way, but I think all of Canada really needs to be on that healing path forward with us.
Okay, we'll leave it there. National Chief at the Assembly of First Nations, Roseanne Archibald, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it, and have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thank you, Wyatt. Take care.
Lisa Raitt is co-chair of the Coalition for a Better Future. She's also former MP for Milton and former deputy leader of the Conservative Party. Lisa, thanks for joining me.
Great pleasure, Wyatt. Thank you for asking me.
Let's just start out with the federal budget today. Do you think it meets the mark given some of the challenges that Canada is currently facing?
Yeah, so as the co-chair of the Coalition for a Better Future, we have a scorecard. And in that scorecard, we take a look at what we think are the things that we need to be doing in this country in order to ensure that we have long-term prosperity for our generation and future generations. And we have about 144 members, and we're all of the same agreement that we want to have long-term growth that is both inclusive and sustainable. So what I can say about today is I do see some really good stuff in there. If you think about what we need for long-term growth, obviously we need to make sure that we convert to electricity. There's a big portion of the budget talking about clean electricity. We know that we want to be part of this big energy supply chain that's being created by the United States, bringing home lots of work that used to happen in other countries and supplying subsidies and incentives to American companies to do it. There's a big piece of the budget dealing with that today. And we want it to be something that's inclusive so that long-term growth is something that isn't just the old way of doing things, that everybody benefits. And you can see sprinkled throughout this budget some good pieces that talk about the importance for a living wage, that any kind of economic growth is going to be good for everybody. So I'm going to give it good. But as always, there's more to go. There's more to go. But I give my hat is off to Chrystia Freeland. I think she's done a good job on this.
And I mean, you mentioned incentives, and obviously President Biden was recently in Canada. Obviously, Canada is a country that's always looking for, more business, more economic potential. Do you think that this budget meets the mark in terms of, providing various businesses, whether that be small, large, et cetera, the incentive to, run their business or at least, partially operate, do business, et cetera, in Canada?
I do. I think there are three important pieces to this. Number one, look, when the Americans are offering you a whole bunch of money to bring your company down to the United States, it's really hard to resist because that money is very helpful to make sure that your company takes off. But a lot of companies just want to stay in Canada. So we don't necessarily have to match exactly what the Biden administration is doing because we can't, because they have so much more money than us. So it's important for us to at least have something financially. The second part, though, is once we know that the company is going to stay and they're going to pursue a project, that if there's any stuff that has to be approved by the federal government, a regulatory process or a permit that's needed, that they get that permit as quickly as possible. We don't have a good reputation in this country in getting projects built in a timely fashion. This budget does mention that they're concerned about it, so they need to do that. The third part is Indigenous reconciliation. In Canada, we have made a commitment to Indigenous economic reconciliation. There is some material in the budget that talks about it. It's going to support businesses as they try to build out these kinds of projects, recognizing that it is part of our fabric. I think we're going to be ahead of the game than the United States, quite frankly. We can't match them financially, but what we can do in terms of ensuring that our communities are welcoming to projects are far and away much better off than they are in the US.
And I guess when you look towards what this federal budget does, for example, a lot of people are looking at this federal budget as, similar to the last federal budget in the way of, given the times that Canada's in, given the affordability challenges, the cost of living challenges, it really is a time where we need to focus on, getting Canada out of this tough kind of economic phase. Do you think that the budget has done that, and to what extent, given the fact that the projected deficit of 40.1 billion is larger than what had been expected?
Yeah, there are people hurting because of the raise of inflation. Now, the Conservative Party is going to tell you that the reason why that we have inflation is because the Trudeau government spent too much money, and they're going to argue about that. And I understand that's a valid point to raise. But the reality is that when people are hurting, you really have to look after them. And that was part of the reason why you're going to see this, what they're calling the grocery rebate, which is just really more of your GST rebate going into people's bank accounts so that they can keep up with a little bit of the price increases. I think, though, Wyatt, one thing that I point out, and I don't think anybody else is talking about this yet, so you may get the scoop on it, but one of the statistics in the budget that really caught my attention that should be of interest to folks of my kids' generation and your generation is that by the time we get to 2017, the amount of money that we're spending on the elderly, which will be me one day, is going to increase by 58%. It's going to go from 60 billion to over $93 billion a year. That's tax dollars, straight up. That's a huge jump. That's far exceeds any revenue jumps that we're going to see. So the country is heading towards a wall when it comes to the aging Gen X's and the aging baby boomers and the cost associated with it. So to make investments today in an economy that needs to keep up with the United States and grow for future generations, super important. So I think it's always good to keep in the back of one's mind that things are not going to get cheaper. Things are not going to get cheaper. We have an aging population. Healthcare is going to be more expensive, and we need to have that long-term economic growth plan that's going to allow us to pay for it as it comes up. Because right now, it's not looking really good.
Willie Hyder is president of the Business Council of Canada, and he joins me now. Thanks so much.
Good to be with you.
Let's start out with some of the key components of today's federal budget, looking at things like some cuts to, big government spending, obviously a grocery rebate, dental care, lots of different things. Obviously, with yourself at the Business Council of Canada as an example, do you think that this budget does enough to address the concerns that, small businesses have, for example, given some of the obstacles that they faced over the course of the last few years with the pandemic, and then, most recently, even with the war between Russia and Ukraine, putting a strain on, goods being able to import and export? What do you make of it all?
Well, look, we're living in a very serious time. This was a critical budget as a result, and for Minister Freeland to find the right balance to address the issues that you raise is a difficult thing to do. We're just literally coming out of the budget announcement that she's made. So devil is always in the detail in these things. I think there are some good intentions here, certainly on the affordability front that you raised right off the top. There are people who have suffered. There are people who are suffering. Inflation, while down to 5.2%, it's still at 5.2%, and we're going to have to watch how that's impacting people. So I think she tried to do what she could to help those who need the help the most. We know about the healthcare spending. It's obviously a social issue program that is critical for our nation, and that money is now going to the provinces to see how they use it. The one we were looking at the most to address the question specifically you've asked is there a strategy here? Is there a strategy here for long-term growth? Because for many businesses, we're looking to the future, your future and the future of our children and others, to say, what are we leaving behind for you? How do we make sure that there's a country that's enjoying growth, that we're well positioned for growth for a long period of time, and that we're able to do it in a fiscally responsible, sustainable way? And I think there's a lot of opportunities here in terms of what the government's announced, especially with their response to the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, in terms of the investments that businesses are going to be able to make so that we can create the jobs for the next generation and for generations to come.
And when you look at what obviously President Biden was just in Canada, you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, something that the American administration introduced in the US. When you look at what Canada can do, perhaps, looking towards other countries, do you think the US is a country that Canada can look towards for, ways to address things like inflation?
Look, from the perspective of what's going on in the world, America is sort of captain of team democracy, if you will, and they're going to want to bring democracies together to set us up to compete with the rest of the world. And that means making sure that we're able to make certain things like semiconductors, like batteries, like the electrical vehicles that we're going to be needing, and other critical infrastructure from cybersecurity and beyond. So I think the president's visit here, and I know you had the pleasure of meeting with him and interviewing him as well, was critically important, because what it said to Canadians is, we're all in this together, and this is a serious time in the world. And Canada has what not only America wants, but Canada has what the world wants. What we need to know and what we need to show is we have the capacity to get to it, the natural resources, in particular the critical minerals. And it's unfortunate our government's made a choice not to allow for more LNG to come. We think that would have been a great solution for decarbonizing countries that are on coal, but also to help subsidize the innovation that's going to be necessary. You know what? This is going to be several $100 billion worth of investments that's going to go into the quote unquote greenification of our economy. And America is a very big part of that, because they're not only your customer, but they're your partner. But there's a whole world out there that we can also share our resources with and grow our economy, which, as I said, is the one thing in this budget that seems to be very anemic. There's no growth really being forecast. There's a lot of spending. And as a result, there's no balanced budget in sight. And as a father, as a business person, I've always been seized with the issue of making sure that I leave the place behind better than I found it. And from a debt perspective and a deficit perspective, we're not on track to doing that. And the only way to get there is growth. So the things that the government has done today to announce the opportunities for growth to happen, hopefully they work, hopefully we implement them well, and hopefully we can create the jobs and the clean economy that we're all looking for.
Green Party leader Elizabeth May joins me now for her perspective on today's federal budget. Ms. May, good of you to make the time. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
Let's just start out with obviously the centerpiece of today's budget in many respects, these new grocery rebates that can provide up to $467 depending on eligibility criteria to families of up to 4 people here in Canada. I guess I'm just wondering, does that amount of compensation for the rising cost of living really meet the mark in your view, given, you know, how much it is now for groceries? In many respects, that could only last in, again, many respects, you know, 2 to 3 trips to the grocery store.
Even that, I mean, for a family of 4, that's a weekly shopping trip, and it's only one time only. So we think it's disappointing. We think it's good to do that, but there could have also been other measures to help low-income Canadians. One we had been pushing for would have been a CERB amnesty. So for people who received the COVID emergency response benefit, the CERB, particularly low-income Canadians, the government intends to continue to go after those people to ask them to pay back that money. That's really punitive and unnecessary. The budget says that for everybody who's having trouble paying back, they'll work with them to develop a repayment schedule. I mean, honestly, the amount of time and money it's going to cost the government of Canada to chase down low-income people is also expensive, and it would be much better just give a CERB amnesty for anyone below a certain income cutoff and focus on getting money from the large corporations that have been making excessive profits, particularly the oil and gas sector, which has seen its profits rise because of Putin attacking Ukraine. So the grocery rebate by itself, which is really readjusting GST rebate, is, I mean, who could be against it? But it is not even a drop in a very large bucket.
And I guess when you look at many respects, and you know, what some of the other opposition parties in the House, specifically the Conservatives, have already come out and essentially said, is that as with any budget economic update, really the general policy message of the Conservatives is they seem to like less government spending and therefore less government programs. In terms of what the Green Party was looking for, to what extent did you get that in this federal budget? And also, you know, given the current economic state of Canada, given the rising cost of living, many people said it was time for the finance minister to perhaps cut back on investing in, you know, major government programs any further. I guess, would you agree?
No, I mean, I think really at this point we obviously support the investment in dental, and we really lament that the government seems to have dropped the ball altogether on something that was in a lot of budget discussions a few years ago, and that's pharmacare. We want to reduce the costs of healthcare for Canadians and make the healthcare system function better, which I think Canadians are desperate to see that. The fastest rising cost of any element of our healthcare system is drug prices, and bringing in pharmacare would save the Canadian economy a tremendous amount and keep Canadians healthier. So we're very sad that pharmacare seems to have been dropped from the agenda. We used to see it, you know, and sort of expecting it any minute. Pharmacare has been replaced, I guess, with dental care, but so many Canadians need to have their pharmaceutical prices covered. When a doctor writes a prescription, it's really important that every Canadian can afford to have that prescription filled, and that's not the case right now, and that has real costs to our healthcare system, because when people don't get the drugs their doctor wants them to have, when they are basically preventing a worse condition by ignoring those pharmaceutical products that a doctor wants you to have, many Canadians, the condition gets worse. And then by the time they get into hospital, it's a catastrophic condition instead of a chronic condition. So we know that we're the only country in the world with a universal healthcare system that doesn't include pharmacare. So we track these things very closely as Greens. We want to see pharmacare. That will be a cost up front, but it's really an accounting question. You're really over that pharmacare investment reduces costs over the whole Canadian economy. So we will keep pushing for it. We also we know that the people in the disability community have been promised the disability benefit, and we have legislation going through the House. But again, this budget should have had a disability benefit payment, because Canadians living with disabilities have a disproportionately high percentage of that population living in actual poverty. We need to lift everyone out of that poverty. We also thought there'd be more money to ensure that Canadians can afford a roof over their head for housing. That isn't in this budget. There is money for housing, but only, and it's not, I say only, it's important, it's critical, but the money for housing in this budget is exclusively for Indigenous Canadians, whether rural or urban or on reserve or in the north. But we still have an acute need for the housing accelerator program that wasn't even mentioned in this budget. So we have a lot of disappointments around what we call the people side of the budget, and then we also divided it up with the planet side of the budget. And there again, we're disappointed not to see a more aggressive set of measures to ensure that we meet our climate targets.
For Bloc Québécois' reaction to today's federal budget, I'm joined now by a Bloc Québécois MP, Nathalie Sinclair Desgagnés. Thanks so much for making the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation, Wyatt.
Let's just start out. Obviously, the Bloc Québécois largely, is for whatever is best for the province of Quebec. Is this budget, in your view, what the province of Quebec needs?
No, unfortunately not. We asked for many things. So we asked for instance, giving you a few examples, we asked for an increase in GIS, so guaranteed income supplement for elderly people. We asked for global reform on employment insurance. Those elements which we deem extremely important, not only for Quebec, but in general for a healthy Canadian society, haven't been fulfilled. And so we can't be supporting this budget if none of our actually only 1 out of our 6 requests was included in this budget.
And on that point, I suppose, when you look at some of the things that are in the budget, obviously the issue of affordability is something that many Canadians are talking about right now, something that is impacting many Canadians on a day-to-day basis. The government included a rebate for groceries that, under certain eligibility criteria, would be around $467 if all of that criteria is met. To what extent, in your view and in the Bloc Québécois' view, will that compensate for the ongoing, rising cost of living? And I guess, were you satisfied on that front?
It's yes, we are happy. We wanted some kind of help for people that are currently living the consequences of inflation. So we think this is a reasonable measure. We would like to see more of them. So it's unfortunately the only one that's included, and it was already announced, and it's just a change of branding that we see in this budget, in the sense that we see now it's for groceries, but it's basically the GST, which we already saw in previous budgets, and just done differently. Instead of being a refund that comes in every 3 months, it's now just a one down payment that's supposed to help you with groceries. It's a measure that we agree with. So if we had to vote on this individually, we would support it, but we would have liked to see way more in this budget, which we aren't seeing.
Joining me now for his perspective and for the perspective of taxpayers, of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, as it relates to today's federal budget, is the director of that organization, Franco Terrazzano. Thanks so much for making the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on today.
Let's just start out with several of the affordability aspects as it relates to today's budget. Of course, we have things like a grocery rebate, for example, included in the budget. That is at a cost of about $2.5 billion to the government, and it'll provide just over $467 in a rebate to certain Canadian families around the size of 4. I guess I'm just wondering, to what extent is a measure like this welcomed by not just yourself, by your organization, and do you think it will be perceived well amongst Canadians?
Well, the GST rebate will be good for some Canadians who get some of their money back. But let's not forget that this is only going to about a third of Canadians. Now, a better way to do this is just cut out the middleman and cut taxes across the board so all Canadians can get some much needed relief. I mean, look, what essentially is going on is they have the government taking money out of your left pocket, then sprinkling some of the money back into some people's right pocket. Now, this is about grocery prices. We're all feeling the pain. So many Canadians wondering, do they get the package of ground beef at the store or the jug of milk at the store? But the problem is that at the same time, you have the government in a couple days increasing the carbon tax, right? That means it's going to be more expensive for farmers to dry their grain with natural gas or propane. It's going to be more expensive for truckers to deliver salad to the store. And when the government raises the cost for farmers, families pay more at the store. When the government raises costs for truckers, families pay more at the store. So what we would have liked is broad-based tax relief, and we didn't see that in the budget.
Dr. Alika Lafontaine is the president of the Canadian Medical Association. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start out first off with healthcare transfers. Obviously, we knew that this was kind of coming. It was obviously reiterated in the budget today. To what extent are you satisfied with the level of priority that the government has put to working with provinces to reach an agreement on healthcare to ultimately, obviously, benefit Canadians?
So because this was announced a month ago, there's been a lot of time to actually dig into the details. I think the way that the government structured this through the 4 different ways that funding happens, it's not just through the Canada Health Transfer. There's also an unrestricted set of funding. There's the bilateral agreements as far as funding, and then there's a pile that I call other, which is things like the Center for Health Workforce Data and Planning. All these together, I think are pretty well thought out. Most of the things that we wanted in the budget actually made their way in there. And I think there's 2 specific areas that we were really excited that made it into the final budget, which were, agreements around data related to the Canada Health Transfer. Often the way that the federal government works with provinces as far as getting them to do things is through clawbacks. But what's different about the strings that are attached this time is that you actually couldn't even get funding unless you agreed to them. So for data, that's one part, and then the recognition of credentials with the bilateral agreements was really the second one. The focus is the right place for this sort of budget, and in healthcare in general, you got to remain cautiously optimistic until you actually have it on paper. And I think we have it on paper now, so we're all around the table. Time to get to work actually fixing these problems.
And perhaps we can touch too now on kind of the aspect of dental care that was put into the budget today. Obviously, that's been something that the NDP and the government have been trying to work on now for a while, given the NDP's supply and confidence deal with the government. I guess, do you have confidence that this deal, or that the dental care aspect of the budget will actually, make an impact? Do you think that it goes far enough?
Yeah, I think the presence of a dental plan, I think really choreographs where health is in the mindset of the federal government. So one of the big fears that people often have is that we'll continue to cut back on public health care and we'll shift it to other places. The fact that we have a Canada dental plan means that we are actually experiencing an expansion of the number of things that the government will actually cover. The second part comes down to the actual things that people will be able to have funded through this program. So we know that dental care is super important. If you have sore teeth or your teeth break, it's difficult for you to eat nutritiously. It's hard for you to have confidence if you have a smile and that has a lot of cavities and other things like that. It's hard for you to live day to day because the pain from a sore tooth can be that painful. And so unlocking the ability for millions of patients to get access to this sort of care, and more importantly, hundreds of thousands of kids who need dental work in order to make sure that they're developing and being able to participate in society in a way that is reasonable and appropriate, I think is really exciting about this program.